Major Friedrich von der Heydt stood in the map room of the 6th Panzer Army headquarters near Münstereifel, Germany, on the evening of December 11, 1944. Before him lay a fresh intelligence summary from Frontier West, Foreign Armies West, the Wehrmacht intelligence section responsible for analyzing Allied forces. The report, stamped with the eagle and swastika of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, contained assessments of American units facing German positions in the Ardennes sector. Von der Heydt, a decorated paratrooper who had fought in Crete and Normandy, read the evaluation with satisfaction. The intelligence officers had rated the American divisions opposite his planned drop zone as inferior quality troops. The summary noted that the American 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions were green, recently arrived formations with no combat experience. Their sectors were thinly held. Their reserves were minimal. The report concluded with a phrase that had appeared in German intelligence documents since the American entry into the war: the Americans showed technical competence but lacked the fighting spirit and tactical flexibility of German forces. This was not new information. Von der Heydt had heard similar assessments throughout his career. American soldiers, the intelligence summaries consistently stated, were soft. They relied too heavily on material superiority. They would not fight effectively when surprised or when cut off from their supplies. They lacked the harsh discipline that created effective infantry. They were the products of a wealthy, democratic society that had never known real hardship. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Von der Heydt had reason to trust these assessments. German military intelligence had a reputation for thoroughness built over decades. The intelligence services had accurately predicted French weaknesses in 1940. They had provided detailed analyses of Soviet forces before Operation Barbarossa. When they evaluated an enemy as inferior, German commanders listened. The major folded the intelligence summary and placed it in his document case. In 4 days, he would parachute behind American lines as part of Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes. His battle group of 1,200 paratroopers would drop ahead of the advancing panzers, seize key crossroads, and spread confusion among the Americans. The intelligence assessment suggested his mission would succeed. The Americans would break when hit by surprise. They would retreat when their comfortable defensive positions were overrun. They had never faced a winter offensive of this scale. What von der Heydt could not know, what the intelligence summaries had failed to capture, was that the American military he was about to fight was fundamentally different from the force German planners had evaluated. The assessments were based on observations that were technically accurate but catastrophically incomplete. American soldiers did come from a wealthy society. They did rely on material superiority. They did lack the rigid discipline of the Wehrmacht. But in the 6 months since D-Day, something had changed. The American military machine that would face von der Heydt and the entire German offensive was no longer the inexperienced force that had struggled in North Africa. It was no longer the formation that had been bloodied at Kasserine Pass. It had become something the German intelligence services had not anticipated and could not adequately measure: an industrial military force capable of sustaining losses that would cripple any European army and continuing to attack with undiminished strength. Von der Heydt placed the intelligence folder in his case and turned to brief his officers. The report said the Americans were soft. In 4 days, he would learn the true cost of that assessment. The German conviction that American soldiers were inferior was not born from arrogance alone. It emerged from a specific military culture and from actual observations that seemed to confirm existing assumptions. The German General Staff, with its roots in the Prussian military reforms of the 19th century, had created the most professional officer corps in the world. German officers studied military history systematically. They trained in staff procedures that emphasized initiative and rapid decision-making. They practiced Kriegspiel, war games, that tested their ability to handle complex battlefield situations. This system had produced the tactical excellence that stunned Europe in 1940. German combined arms coordination, the integration of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power, was unmatched. German junior officers were trained to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders, following the principle of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. A German lieutenant could make decisions that in other armies required a colonel's approval. This flexibility had allowed German forces to punch through French defenses that were materially superior, to encircle armies that outnumbered them, to achieve victories that seemed impossible by simple calculation of forces. When German intelligence officers evaluated the American military, they applied the standards of this professional military culture. What they saw confirmed their expectations of American inadequacy. The United States Army of 1939 numbered only 190,000 men, ranking 19th in the world, smaller than Romania's forces. American divisions trained with trucks marked tank because actual tanks were not available. Officers conducted exercises with wooden guns. The National Guard units that formed the backbone of expansion plans were part-time soldiers with obsolete equipment. Even after American mobilization began in 1940, German observers noted continuing weaknesses. American officers seemed to lack thorough military education. Many had been civilians a year earlier, rapidly promoted through an expanding force. They relied heavily on written orders and procedures rather than the initiative German doctrine prized. American training emphasized individual comfort and welfare in ways that seemed incompatible with military discipline. German intelligence reports from neutral countries described American training camps with elaborate facilities, regular leave schedules, and concern for soldier morale that seemed excessive by Wehrmacht standards. The German assessment appeared validated by American performance in North Africa. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Erwin Rommel attacked inexperienced American units and achieved local success. American soldiers retreated in disorder. Equipment was abandoned. Entire units lost cohesion. Rommel himself reported that American troops were brave but poorly led and inadequately trained. This single battle, though ultimately inconclusive, seemed to confirm everything German intelligence had predicted about American military capability. Frontier West, the intelligence organization evaluating American forces, compiled these observations into systematic assessments. The organization was led by professional intelligence officers who had spent careers analyzing foreign militaries. They gathered information from multiple sources. Aerial reconnaissance photographed American equipment and positions, signals intelligence intercepted American radio communications, prisoner interrogations provided direct testimony about training, morale, and unit capabilities, intelligence summaries from neutral countries reported on American industrial production and military organization. From this information, German intelligence constructed a picture of the American military that seemed coherent and accurate. American soldiers, they concluded, came from a society that had known only peace and prosperity for generations. They lacked exposure to hardship. Their training was relatively brief compared to German standards. Their officers were amateurs, civilians in uniform. They possessed abundant equipment but questionable will to use it effectively. They would fight well when circumstances were favorable but would collapse when surprised, isolated, or deprived of their material advantages. This assessment appeared in intelligence summaries distributed throughout the Wehrmacht. It informed planning at every level from Army Group headquarters to frontline battalions. It shaped tactical decisions and strategic calculations. And it was about to collide with a reality that German intelligence had failed to grasp, that industrial capacity could create a form of military power fundamentally different from anything European military tradition had produced. The German intelligence assessment of American military weakness rested on a foundation that seemed solid, direct comparison with German military standards. A German infantry division in 1944 contained approximately 15,000 men organized into 3 infantry regiments plus supporting artillery, engineers, and service units. The soldiers had typically received 6 months of basic training, far longer than American basic training periods of 8 to 13 weeks. German NCOs, the sergeants and corporals who led squads and platoons, were career professionals who had often served for years before the war began. German tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive action and counterattack. When a position was lost, German procedure called for immediate counterattack to restore the line. This doctrine had proven effective in defensive fighting across multiple theaters. German units routinely counterattacked against superior forces, sometimes succeeding through speed and violence of action. To German officers observing American forces, the American tendency to consolidate positions before advancing, to wait for artillery support, to proceed methodically rather than exploiting momentum, appeared to indicate lack of offensive spirit. The material abundance of American forces actually reinforced German assumptions about American weakness. German intelligence reports noted that American divisions possessed extraordinary quantities of vehicles. A typical American infantry division in 1944 had over 2,000 trucks, compared to perhaps 500 in a German division, which still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. American artillery ammunition expenditure seemed profligate by German standards, firing preparation barges that consumed more shells in an hour than some German batteries possessed in total. To German observers, this abundance suggested that Americans could not fight effectively without overwhelming material support. Intelligence summaries noted that when American units were surrounded or cut off from supply, their combat effectiveness declined sharply. The conclusion seemed obvious: American forces were dependent on their logistics, vulnerable to disruption, incapable of sustained fighting when deprived of continuous supply. German propaganda reinforced these intelligence assessments. Newspapers and radio broadcasts described Americans as untested forces, technologically advanced but morally soft. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels' broadcasts referred to American soldiers as products of a mongrel democracy lacking the racial cohesion and national will of German forces. German soldiers received steady messaging that while Americans possessed abundant equipment, they lacked the character necessary for sustained combat. Even German generals who respected American industrial capacity often dismissed American fighting quality. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, acknowledged American material superiority but questioned whether American soldiers possessed the will to endure the casualties necessary to break German defenses. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who had fought Americans in Italy, reported that American forces were predictable, methodical, and could be defeated by mobile defense and counterattack despite their numerical and material advantages. This assessment extended to American armored forces. German intelligence recognized that American tank production far exceeded German capacity. But intelligence summaries noted that American tank crews received relatively brief training, often just a few weeks in actual tanks before deployment. American armor tactics, as observed in Normandy, seemed to lack the flexibility and aggression of German panzer doctrine. American Shermans were mechanically reliable but undergunned compared to German Tigers and Panthers. The conclusion: American armor was numerous but qualitatively inferior, vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons and superior German tanks. By December 1944, these assessments had hardened into accepted wisdom throughout the Wehrmacht. From Hitler's headquarters at the Führerbunker to frontline company commanders, German military leadership believed they understood American capabilities and limitations. The Americans were inexperienced. They were soft. They relied on material superiority because they lacked the fighting spirit to prevail through skill and determination alone. This belief would inform every aspect of German planning for Operation Walk dem Rhein. And in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it would meet the reality of what American industrial power had actually created. Architected historical narrative sections integrating verified facts and primary sources. Operation Walk dem Rhein began at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, with an artillery barrage that lit the winter darkness across an 85-mile front. 200,000 German soldiers from 29 divisions surged forward through the Ardennes forest, the same terrain German armies had used to outflank French defenses in 1940. The Wehrmacht had concentrated virtually its last strategic reserve for this offensive: 1,300 tanks, 2,000 artillery pieces, and 800 aircraft that had been hoarded for months while Allied air forces dominated European skies. The initial German advance seemed to validate every intelligence assessment about American weakness. The 106th Infantry Division, positioned in the Schnee-Eifel, had arrived in France only 11 days earlier. Most of its soldiers had never heard hostile fire. When German forces attacked from three sides, 2 entire regiments of the 106th, over 8,000 men, were encircled within 48 hours. By December 19, these regiments surrendered, the largest capitulation of American forces in the European theater. German intelligence officers noted the surrender with satisfaction. The Americans had broken exactly as predicted when surprised and surrounded. The 99th Infantry Division, another green formation that had entered combat only weeks earlier, also faced the initial German assault. Intelligence summaries had rated this division as particularly vulnerable. But the 99th did not collapse. At Hofen and Monshaw on the northern shoulder of the German advance, elements of the 99th held their positions against repeated attacks by the 326th Volksgrenadier Division. The Americans occupied prepared defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire. They called down artillery with a volume and accuracy that stunned German attackers. After 3 days of assault, the German forces abandoned their attacks in this sector, having failed to achieve their objectives. This pattern, surrender in one location and stubborn resistance in another, presented German commanders with contradictory evidence. The surrenders seemed to confirm American fragility. But the resistance suggested something more complex than simple weakness. At Elsenborn Ridge, American forces established a defensive line that German attacks could not break. At St. Vith, a critical road junction, American units including remnants of the shattered 106th Division held out for 6 days against superior German forces, disrupting the German timetable. The German offensive plan had assumed that American forces would retreat rapidly when struck by overwhelming force. This assumption derived from observations of American tactical doctrine. American units typically withdrew when flanked or when facing encirclement, falling back to prepared positions rather than fighting in place at all costs. German planners interpreted this as weakness rather than as systematic military procedure. They expected that American forces, once their defensive lines were penetrated, would conduct general withdrawal, perhaps retreating all the way to the Meuse River, abandoning significant terrain and equipment. Instead, American units responded in ways German intelligence had not predicted. Cut-off units established defensive perimeters and continued fighting rather than surrendering. American artillery, directed by forward observers using radio communication, delivered fire support with volume German forces could not match. Even when surrounded, American units maintained communication via radio networks that continued functioning despite battlefield chaos. Major von der Heydt, whose paratroop drop had been scattered by weather and errors, found himself with only 300 of his 1,200 men assembled at the drop zone. His battle group was supposed to seize a critical road junction and hold it for the advancing panzers. But American forces responded to his presence faster than German planning had anticipated. Within hours, American patrols located his positions. American artillery began targeting his scattered units. Von der Heydt realized his mission was impossible not because his soldiers lacked courage but because American reaction speed exceeded German expectations. The Americans were not retreating in confusion. They were responding systematically to German presence, marshalling forces, coordinating counteractions through radio networks that seemed to function regardless of battlefield disruption. By December 20th, German intelligence officers at Army Group headquarters were receiving field reports that contradicted their pre-offensive assessments. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in the center of the German advance, had been surrounded by German forces on December 20th. The town was defended by the 101st Airborne Division, elements of the 10th Armored Division, and various attached units, approximately 18,000 American soldiers. German intelligence had evaluated the 101st as an elite formation, but even elite troops were expected to surrender or attempt breakout when surrounded and cut off from supply. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, sent a written ultimatum to the American commander on December 22. The message, delivered under flag of truce, called for surrender within 2 hours to avoid total annihilation. The German ultimatum assumed the Americans, facing encirclement, would recognize the hopelessness of their situation and surrender to avoid casualties. The American response was a single word: nuts. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, rejected the surrender demand. The Americans in Bastogne would not surrender. They would continue fighting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This response baffled German commanders. Von Lüttwitz had surrounded the town with superior forces. He had cut American supply lines. His artillery could strike American positions at will. By conventional military logic, particularly by German military doctrine that emphasized aggressive action but also recognized when positions were untenable, the Americans should have understood their situation was impossible and accepted terms. But the Americans at Bastogne possessed something German intelligence had failed to quantify: confidence in their logistics system. The surrounded Americans believed, correctly, that supply could be maintained by air. Beginning on December 23 when weather cleared, American C-47 transport aircraft began dropping supplies into Bastogne. The drops included ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The volume was insufficient for sustained operations, but it was enough to keep American forces fighting effectively. German forces had no equivalent capability. When German units were surrounded on the Eastern Front, they could not rely on aerial resupply at this scale. They typically had two options: break out or surrender. The Americans chose a third option: hold positions, maintain defensive integrity, and wait for relief that they believed would arrive. This belief was not irrational hope. It reflected understanding of American operational capabilities that German intelligence had underestimated. The American supply system, with its massive truck fleets and efficient logistics networks, could redirect forces and supplies at speed German planners had not anticipated. On December 22, General George S. Patton's Third Army, which had been attacking eastward in the Saar region, began disengaging from its current operations and pivoting 90 degrees north to strike the southern flank of the German penetration. This maneuver, moving 3 entire divisions over winter roads, coordinating supply through a logistics network that had to be completely reoriented, was accomplished in 72 hours. German general staff officers, trained in the complexities of moving large formations, considered Patton's pivot nearly impossible in the time frame accomplished. A German army group would have required a week or more to execute a comparable reorientation. This responsiveness reflected fundamental differences in military organization. American forces relied heavily on motor transport and radio communication. Orders could be transmitted rapidly through radio networks. Supplies could be redirected using truck convoys that moved day and night. Fuel and ammunition reserves existed in quantities that allowed sustained operations without pause for resupply. The American military had been built to operate at a tempo German forces, still partially dependent on rail transport and horse-drawn logistics, could not sustain. By December 26, when elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through German lines and reached Bastogne, the siege had lasted 6 days. The Americans had not surrendered. They had not attempted desperate breakout. They had simply held their positions and continued fighting until relieved. The psychological impact on German soldiers of what they encountered at Bastogne and across the Ardennes battlefield began appearing in prisoner interrogation reports compiled by American intelligence officers. A German lieutenant from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, captured near Bastogne on December 27, told interrogators that his company had attacked American positions expecting to face demoralized, poorly supplied defenders. Instead, they encountered Americans who seemed to have unlimited artillery ammunition, who coordinated their defensive fires through radio networks his company could not disrupt, and who counterattacked aggressively when German forces attempted to consolidate captured positions. The lieutenant described a specific engagement on December 23. His company, approximately 120 men, had attacked an American position on the perimeter of Bastogne's defensive ring. The position was held by perhaps 40 American paratroopers. German doctrine called for attacking prepared positions with 3-to-1 numerical superiority, which his company possessed. The attack began with a brief mortar barrage, then German infantry advanced through wooded terrain toward the American foxholes. American forces responded with rifle fire, machine gun fire, and called artillery strikes that began falling within 2 minutes of initial contact. The American artillery was not random harassing fire. It was directed, accurate fire that struck German assault formations with devastating effect. The lieutenant's company took 30% casualties within 10 minutes and withdrew without achieving its objective. When he reported this failure to his battalion commander, he was told similar failures were occurring across multiple sectors. American artillery fire volume exceeded anything German forces had encountered on the Western Front. This artillery dominance reflected industrial capacity German intelligence had documented but failed to appreciate in operational terms. American artillery units in the European theater fired an average of 95 rounds per gun per day during the Battle of the Bulge. German artillery, constrained by ammunition shortages, fired perhaps 20 rounds per gun per day. This 5-to-1 expenditure ratio meant that American defensive positions had artillery support German attackers could not suppress. Every American battalion had attached artillery forward observers with radio communication directly to artillery batteries. Fire missions could be called and executed within minutes. German forces attempting to advance through the Ardennes encountered not just American defensive positions but an entire military system that functioned differently from what German doctrine anticipated. When German units achieved local success and penetrated American lines, they expected to exploit those breakthroughs rapidly, driving deep into American rear areas before defenders could respond. This exploitation phase, the moment when mobile forces transformed tactical success into operational victory, had worked brilliantly in France in 1940. But in the Ardennes, German breakthrough units found that penetrating American lines did not create the exploitation opportunities doctrine predicted. American units responded to German presence in their rear areas not with panic but with systematic countermeasures. Combat engineers destroyed bridges and blocked roads, delaying German advance. Military police directed traffic and maintained communication networks. Supply convoys, when threatened by German forces, defended themselves with organic weapons rather than abandoning supplies. A German tank commander, captured after his Panther tank was destroyed by American forces near Celis on December 26, reported that his column had advanced nearly 30 miles beyond the initial breakthrough point, deeper than any German penetration in the offensive. His unit believed they were achieving the operational breakthrough that would carry them to the Meuse River. But American resistance had not collapsed behind them. Instead, American forces seemed to appear from multiple directions, attacking his column's flanks and cutting supply lines. When his tank ran out of fuel, he discovered that German supply columns could not reach his position because American forces had re-established control of the roads his unit had just traversed. This was not the behavior of soft, inexperienced troops breaking under surprise attack. This was systematic military response by an organization that could absorb tactical defeats and continue functioning operationally. Major Friedrich von der Heydt surrendered to American forces on December 21, 1944, after spending 4 days behind American lines with his scattered paratroop battle group. He had dropped into the Ardennes with 1,200 men. Only 300 had reached the assembly area. His mission to seize crossroads and spread confusion among American forces had failed completely. When American interrogators questioned him, von der Heydt provided detailed information about German planning for the offensive. He also expressed his assessment of what he had witnessed. The Americans, he told his interrogators, were not the force German intelligence had described. They had responded to his presence rapidly, systematically, and with overwhelming firepower. He had expected scattered, confused resistance. Instead, he encountered coordinated American reaction using radio networks that seemed immune to disruption and artillery support that arrived within minutes of contact. Von der Heydt would survive the war and later become a professor of law, but his experience in the Ardennes had shattered his confidence in German intelligence assessments. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when German forces withdrew to their start lines, having failed to achieve any strategic objectives. German losses were catastrophic by any measure. The Wehrmacht committed approximately 410,000 men to the offensive. By its conclusion, German casualties exceeded 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. More significantly, the Germans lost approximately 600 tanks and assault guns, 1,700 aircraft, and virtually all their remaining mobile reserves. These losses were irreplaceable. German industrial production, hampered by Allied bombing and resource shortages, could not manufacture replacement tanks at the rate they were being destroyed. The Luftwaffe pilots killed in the offensive represented the last generation of experienced German aviators, men who could not be replaced by the hastily trained recruits emerging from abbreviated training programs. The infantry divisions committed to the Ardennes were withdrawn as hollow formations, their combat strength reduced by 50 to 70%. American losses were also severe, approximately 75,000 American casualties including 19,000 killed. The 106th Infantry Division, which had surrendered 2 regiments, was effectively destroyed as a fighting formation. Other units sustained heavy casualties. But American losses could be replaced. The American replacement system, feeding individual soldiers into existing units, maintained division strength even while sustaining casualties that would have eliminated European formations. American equipment losses, including tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles, were made good within weeks through a supply system that German forces had no equivalent to match. By February 1945, American forces had not only recovered from the German offensive but had resumed their advance into Germany with undiminished strength. The 1st Infantry Division, which had fought through the Bulge, was attacking the Siegfried Line fortifications. The 3rd Armored Division was advancing toward the Rhine. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, both of which had sustained significant casualties at Bastogne and other locations, were refitted and returned to combat operations within 6 weeks. The German intelligence failure at the Bulge was not merely tactical error. It represented systematic misunderstanding of how American military power functioned. German intelligence officers had correctly identified American dependence on material superiority. They had accurately noted American soldiers' relative inexperience compared to Wehrmacht veterans. They had documented American tactical limitations. But they had failed to grasp that these characteristics, which appeared to be weaknesses in traditional military analysis, were actually features of a military system organized around different principles than European armies. American forces could sustain losses that would cripple German divisions because American replacement systems were designed for sustained attrition. American forces could maintain offensive operations despite tactical setbacks because American logistics could deliver supplies at volumes German forces could not interdict. American forces could coordinate complex operations rapidly because American radio networks provided communication capabilities German forces lacked. The Americans were not soft. They were organized for industrial warfare at a scale German military tradition had never encountered. The 6 months following the Battle of the Bulge witnessed the complete collapse of German military power in the West. In January 1945, American and British forces held positions along the German border from the North Sea to Switzerland. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, Allied forces occupied all of Western Germany, had advanced beyond the Elbe River, and had linked up with Soviet forces driving from the east. The title of German divisions destroyed or rendered combat ineffective during this period is difficult to calculate precisely because German military records from this period are incomplete. Many divisions that existed on paper contained only remnants of their authorized strength. Units were dissolved, merged, or redesignated as the Wehrmacht's organizational structure disintegrated. But examining verified combat records and prisoner of war data provides clear evidence of the scale of German losses. In the Rhineland campaign from February through March 1945, American forces captured approximately 293,000 German prisoners. The German divisions defending the Rhineland were systematically encircled and destroyed. The 9th Panzer Division, which had fought at the Bulge, was trapped west of the Rhine with fewer than 2,000 men remaining from its original strength of over 15,000. The 11th Panzer Division was reduced to battalion strength by March 1. The 116th Panzer Division lost all its tanks and most of its infantry in fighting around Dusseldorf. Wehrmacht records, those that survived the war, show that by April 1945, German military strength in the West had deteriorated to the point where divisions existed only as administrative designations. The 353rd Infantry Division was reported as containing fewer than 500 combat-effective soldiers. The 89th Infantry Division had been reduced to regimental strength. Volksgrenadier divisions, hastily formed units that had replaced destroyed regular infantry divisions, were being committed to combat with minimal training and equipment. The American advance during this period was characterized by operational tempo German forces could not match. American armored divisions advanced up to 50 miles per day when encountering minimal resistance. When German forces established defensive positions, American artillery subjected those positions to preparatory bombardment using ammunition expenditures that German forces considered impossible. One American corps fired over 100,000 artillery rounds in a 24-hour period during the Rhine crossing operations in March 1945. This single day's expenditure exceeded total artillery ammunition available to some German armies for an entire month. German soldiers, captured in increasing numbers as defensive lines collapsed, provided consistent testimony to American interrogators about why resistance had become futile. A German sergeant, captured in early April near the Ruhr Pocket, told interrogators that his battalion had received no supplies for 3 days before surrendering. They had minimal ammunition, no hot food, and no medical supplies. Meanwhile, American forces that surrounded his position seemed to have unlimited everything: ammunition, food, fuel, and equipment. The sergeant said his men had joked bitterly that Americans must have factories that produced fully equipped divisions overnight, because no matter how many Americans were killed, more Americans appeared the next day with new equipment. This observation, though expressed with dark humor, identified the fundamental reality German intelligence had failed to appreciate. American industrial capacity was producing military force faster than German forces could destroy it. The United States manufactured approximately 88,000 tanks during World War II. Germany produced approximately 28,000 tanks and assault guns total from 1939 to 1945. American aircraft production exceeded 300,000 aircraft. German production reached approximately 120,000 aircraft. These numerical disparities translated into operational realities on the battlefield. When a German division lost 50% of its strength, it typically required months to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. When an American division sustained equivalent losses, replacements arrived within weeks, maintaining the division's combat effectiveness. The intelligence assessment that Major von der Heydte had read on December 11, 1944, the report that described American forces as soft and dependent on material superiority, had not been technically inaccurate. American soldiers did come from a society that had known prosperity. They did rely on abundant equipment and supplies. They did lack the harsh discipline of Wehrmacht formations. Every specific observation in the intelligence summary could be verified. But the assessment had drawn precisely the wrong conclusion from accurate data. German intelligence officers, trained in a military tradition that valued individual combat skill, tactical flexibility, and aggressive spirit, had evaluated American forces using criteria that were increasingly irrelevant to modern industrial warfare. They had asked whether American soldiers could fight effectively when surrounded and cut off from supplies. They should have asked whether American operations were designed to prevent such situations through systematic application of material superiority. They had noted that American units withdrew when flanked rather than fighting in place at all costs. They interpreted this as weakness rather than recognizing it as doctrine that preserved combat power for sustained operations. They had observed American dependence on radio communication and motorized logistics. They failed to understand that these dependencies were actually force multipliers that allowed American units to coordinate and sustain operations at tempo German forces could not match. The German intelligence failure in the Ardennes was ultimately a failure to comprehend that warfare had changed fundamentally. The German military tradition, rooted in the campaigns of Frederick the Great and refined through the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, emphasized decisive battle achieved through superior operational art. German generals studied canny, where Hannibal destroyed a Roman army through tactical brilliance despite numerical inferiority. They analyzed the campaigns of Napoleon and Malta, where battlefield genius compensated for material limitations. But American military doctrine, developed in the industrial age and refined during World War II, operated on different principles. American forces did not seek decisive battle through tactical brilliance. They sought to apply continuous pressure across the entire front using material superiority that could not be defeated by tactical skill. When American attacks failed at one point, they attacked at another. When casualties depleted units, replacements arrived. When equipment was destroyed, new equipment appeared. The system was designed to grind forward regardless of tactical setbacks. German intelligence had documented this American approach thoroughly. Their reports contained detailed information about American production capacity, logistics capabilities, and replacement systems. But German analysis treated these characteristics as supporting elements for an army that would ultimately have to fight decisive battles using traditional military virtues. They never fully grasped that for American forces, logistics and production were not supporting elements. They were the primary weapons. The cost of this misunderstanding was German defeat in the West. The Ardennes offensive consumed Germany's last strategic reserves in an operation based on assumptions about American weakness that proved catastrophically wrong. The divisions destroyed in the Rhineland campaigns could not be replaced because Germany lacked the industrial capacity and manpower to rebuild them. The Wehrmacht that had stunned Europe with its tactical brilliance in 1940 was ground down by an enemy that accepted tactical defeats, absorbed losses that would have broken European armies, and continued attacking with industrial production replacing every loss. Major von der Heydt, reading intelligence summaries in a map room on December 11, 1944, had trusted assessments compiled by professional intelligence officers using information gathered from multiple sources. Those assessments told him the Americans were soft. For days later, scattered in the frozen forests of the Ardennes with his mission failed and his men dying, he learned what that assessment had cost. The Americans were not soft. They were something German military tradition had no framework to evaluate, an industrial force that measured strength not in courage or tactical skill but in tons of supplies delivered, artillery rounds fired, and replacement soldiers fed into combat faster than they could be killed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.